Claire Morgan had always believed that some moments leave a mark on your soul, quiet and invisible, but permanent. That Thursday afternoon was one of those moments, and it began with a simple email. She had been teaching literature at Willow, Creek High in Vermont, for 6 years, her days filled with poetry, essays, and the soft rhythm of teenage voices finding their place in the world. Claire was the kind of woman who found beauty in the details: rain against the window, the smell of old books, handwritten letters, and the way certain words could stay with you long after a chapter ended. At 32, she had made peace with a quiet life. She wasn't married, not in a relationship, and didn't mind spending weekends with a glass of red wine and a well-worn novel. Love hadn't passed her by. It just hadn't arrived yet. And maybe somewhere deep down she had stopped, expecting it to. Then came the email. It was short, professional, and yet something about it made her stomach flutter. Ms. Morgan, please meet me in the main office meeting room after school. Principal Hayes, Daniel Hayes. The name alone made her pause. He had once been the calm center of the school, a man of quiet authority, always composed, always polite. He had left 2 years ago after his marriage fell apart, and though no one knew all the details, there had been whispers of heartbreak, of silence behind closed doors. Claire had felt it then, a distant ache she never had the right to claim. When Daniel returned as principal 3 weeks ago, he was different. Older, a little weathered, but still handsome in that strong, understated way that made women glance twice and never admit it. His presence stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in years. But she kept her distance. He was her boss, and she was not the type to chase shadows. That's why her hands felt oddly nervous as she opened the meeting room door. It was late afternoon, and the hallway was quiet, echoing with the last footsteps of students heading home. The room was bathed in golden sunlight, and Daniel stood near the window, his silhouette outlined by the soft light. He turned when he heard her enter, offering a gentle nod. "Claire," he said, and the way her name sounded in his voice made something flutter in her chest. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady, casual, professional, but it was hard with the way he was looking at her. Not just as a teacher or a staff member, but as someone he had been waiting to talk to for a long time. "Please, sit," he said quietly. She obeyed, though her heart was already racing. The room felt smaller now, more intimate. The air somehow heavier with things unspoken. He didn't sit. He stayed standing, hands in his pockets, staring out the window like he needed a few more seconds before saying something difficult. "I needed to talk to you," he began, his voice low and sincere. "Not as your principal, just as a man who's been holding something in." Claire felt her throat tighten. She didn't know what he was about to say, but something inside her already knew this was not going to be a typical conversation. The door behind them clicked shut, soft but final. And just like that, the past, the present, and whatever was about to be said were locked in that sunlit room. She didn't know what he was about to confess. She didn't know that after this moment she would never be able to look at him, or herself, the same way again. But she would remember it, forever. The silence in the room felt heavy, like something alive, waiting to break. Claire sat still, her fingers nervously brushing the edge of her skirt, her mind spinning with questions she didn't dare ask. Daniel stood only a few feet away, but the space between them felt like a cliff. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long amber shadows across the table between them. He looked at her, truly looked, and in that moment, it was as if time softened around them. "I've been thinking about you," he said, and the words felt like they came from somewhere. Deep, maybe even from pain. His voice was gentle, but there was an ache beneath it. "Since I left this school. More than I should have." Claire blinked, unsure if she had misunderstood him. Teachers didn't hear things like that from their principals. Women like her didn't expect to be the quiet thoughts of someone like Daniel Hayes. He had always carried himself with control, grace, the kind of man who never let emotions get the best of him. But now, there was something raw in his eyes, like a man no longer afraid of feeling too much. "I don't expect anything from you," he continued, slowly walking toward the table, placing his hands on the back of a chair, still not sitting. "But I promised myself, if I ever came back, I'd tell you." His voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "You were the one part of my day that felt calm when everything else was falling apart. I'd see you in the hallway, hear you talk about books with your students, and it reminded me that not everything had to end in silence." Claire felt her throat tighten. There was something about the way he said those words, how they weren't rehearsed or perfect, just real. It wasn't some romantic line from a novel. It was a confession, delicate and honest, and far more intimate than any touch. Her heart beat faster, confused but full. She remembered moments too, passing glances in staff meetings, quiet conversations by the coffee pot, the way he had lingered. Once when she laughed at something silly. At the time, she thought she was imagining it. But now, maybe it hadn't been just her. Maybe he had noticed her in all the small ways she noticed him. Still, this was real, and it scared her just as much as it moved her. "I never meant to make you uncomfortable," Daniel added quickly, sensing her silence. "I just couldn't go on pretending I didn't feel something anymore. And if this changes the way you see me, I'll understand." Claire finally found her voice, though it was soft and unsure. "Daniel, I don't know what to say." But before either of them could speak again, a knock interrupted the moment. The secretary's voice was muffled through the door. "Principal Hayes, the board meeting starts in 10. He closed his eyes briefly, like he had forgotten the world existed beyond that room. Then he gave her a small smile, sad, tender, and full of things left unsaid. "Duty calls," he whispered. "But thank you for listening." He walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at her. "No matter what happens, I don't regret telling you." And then he was gone, the door closing. Quietly behind him, Claire sat alone, stunned, her emotions tangled between confusion, warmth, and a strange sense of loss. She hadn't touched him. He hadn't asked for anything. But somehow, everything had changed. The words he had left behind echoed inside her like poetry. Unexpected, powerful, unforgettable. And in that empty meeting room, still glowing with fading sunlight, Claire realized that some confessions don't end with answers. They begin with longing. The days after the meeting room confession felt like walking through a dream Claire couldn't fully wake up from. Everything looked the same. Students rushing through the halls, morning coffee in the teacher's lounge, staff meetings filled with small talk and lesson plans. But Claire felt different. It was as if something inside her had been gently shaken loose. She replayed Daniel's words over and over, sometimes during her drive to school, sometimes while washing dishes, sometimes in the quiet dark before sleep. "You were the calm," he had said. Simple words, but they had taken root in her heart. And now, every time she passed him in the hallway, her body tensed in ways she couldn't control. He didn't treat her any differently. In fact, he was more careful now, almost distant. Professional smiles, polite nods, no long stares, no accidental brushes of the hand. It was like nothing had ever been said, but Claire knew better. And that made the silence between them feel louder than any conversation. At night, when the world was still, Claire questioned herself. Was it just a moment for him? Something he needed to say and move on from? Or was he holding back out of respect? The unknown twisted inside her, a mix of longing and fear. She wasn't a teenager, lost in a crush. She was a grown woman who had learned to live quietly, to not expect surprises. But Daniel's words had lit something in her she hadn't felt in years. Desire, yes. But more than that. Connection. That rare kind of emotional closeness that doesn't ask for attention, it simply sees you, and she didn't want to let it slip away without knowing what it really meant. A week later, on a rainy Friday evening, Claire found herself at her favorite bookstore cafe downtown. It was a warm, familiar place with soft lighting, shelves of old novels, and quiet booths where no one asked questions. She often came here after long days, ordering her usual herbal tea and flipping through classic romances. That night, she had Wuthering Heights open in front of her. But she wasn't reading. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Daniel and that room. And then, as if her heart had summoned him, the chair across from her pulled out. She looked up, and there he was. Daniel. His coat was damp, his dark hair messy from the rain, but his eyes held that same softness she remembered. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, voice quiet, unsure. Claire nodded slowly. "You came here on purpose." "I did," he admitted. "I wasn't sure I should. But I couldn't stop thinking about that day. And about you." He sat across from her, leaning slightly forward, as if afraid she might disappear. "I've spent so long trying to be careful, doing the right thing. But with you, Claire, it's different. I feel something real, and I don't want to pretend I don't." She didn't speak right away. Her fingers curled around her tea mug for warmth. The rain tapped gently against the window beside them. Finally, she said softly, "I care too, but I don't know how this works. We work together. People talk." Daniel nodded. "I know. That's why I'm not asking for answers tonight. Just moments. A chance to figure it out. Together." His hand slowly reached across the table. Not demanding, just hoping, and Claire placed hers in his. Their fingers touched, and the contact sent a quiet warmth through her, calming and electric at once. She looked into his eyes and saw no pressure, no rush, just longing, just sincerity. And in that small, rainy bookstore, two people who had spent years carrying quiet heartbreak sat across from each other, holding hands like it was the beginning of something they never thought they'd find again. Something fragile, brave, and real. The weeks that followed were slow and tender, like a song playing softly in the background of Claire's life. She and Daniel didn't dive into something reckless. they weren't those kinds of people. Instead, they met in the quiet spaces between responsibility and longing. Walks by the lake after work, sitting close but never too close, coffee at the bookstore cafe, where their conversations ran deep, about books, heartbreak, their families, and the small fears they didn't say out loud to anyone else. They didn't talk about labels or plans. They just existed in this delicate, growing bond that neither of them had expected. Daniel had been honest from the beginning. He didn't want to cause problems for Claire or put her in a position where people might judge her. He carried the weight of his position heavily, always thinking of how it might look if someone misunderstood. But in private, he was different. He'd reach across the table to touch her hand gently, or hold her gaze a second longer than necessary, and it was in those moments that Claire felt something quietly powerful, a kind of love that didn't need grand gestures to feel real. Still, the world around them didn't pause. There were always meetings, classes, school functions, and the looming weight of what their connection might look like to others. Daniel remained professional at school, never letting a flicker of emotion show in front of others. Sometimes it hurt Claire, the way he had to hide what was growing between them. But she understood. He was trying to protect her, and that mattered more than anything. She had never known a man so careful with her heart. But eventually, it was Daniel who made the hardest decision. One late evening, after they had watched the sun set in the quiet park just beyond the school grounds, he turned to her and said, "I've put in for a transfer to a different district." Claire felt her heart drop, her breath catching in her throat. "You're leaving?" she whispered. He looked at her with those steady eyes. "Not because I want to leave you, because I want to be free to love you." The words stunned her, not just because of what he said, but because of the way he said them. Calm, certain, as if he had thought about this for weeks, and finally let the answer rise to the surface. Claire felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the way he chose her, fully, intentionally, without asking her to sacrifice a piece of herself. In the following weeks, they made peace with the change. They didn't rush anything, didn't promise forever, but they promised honesty. Daniel's last day came quietly. No big goodbye, just a normal end-of-week meeting, a few casual handshakes, and then he was gone. But before he left, he asked Claire to meet him in that same meeting room one last time. She walked in, just as she had weeks ago, and found him standing in the same spot by the window. The sunlight hit his face gently. He turned to her, smiling, in that quiet way she had come to love. "I wanted to say goodbye here," he said, "because this is where it started." He stepped closer, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'll remember this room for the rest of my life. Not because I was the principal, but because I fell in love in it." Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "So will I." Now, even years later, when she walks past that room, it all comes rushing back. The words, the tension, the warmth, the hope. What happened in that room never made it to the morning announcements. It wasn't part of any curriculum. But it lives, in her, in the space between memory and feeling, where real love always stays, quiet, lasting, unforgettable.